Bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue. Je m'appelle Steve Staples. Je suis le président de l'Institut Rideau. Good morning, I'm Steve Staples. I'm the president of the Rideau Institute. We're an independent nonprofit defense and foreign policy research group based here in Ottawa. And I'm very happy today to welcome Bill Hartung from New York, who is visiting Ottawa today, meeting with folks and talking about Canada's involvement in the international arms industry. I think there's a fundamental question at play right now in Canada: should we have an arms industry? It would seem that the Conservative government right now thinks that we should, that they have been working with defense companies to support military production in Canada, in part to supply the Canadian forces, but also, and perhaps more alarmingly, to supply the international marketplace for arms and defense products and services. Budget 2013 committed the government to develop new initiatives that would leverage Canadian defense spending to the benefit of the Canadian economy as they saw it, which was following on the recommendations of an expert panel that was headed up by Open Text Executive Chairman and Chief Strategy Officer Tom Jenkins, or the Jenkins Report, as it became known. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with encouraging job creation from legitimate defense spending for our armed forces. However, promoting an arms industry is something completely different. Here, Canadians should be right to worry about the misplaced influence that companies could have to steer government spending to meet the needs of those companies above what the needs of the military is, or support Canadian military exports where they could possibly be used in conflicts or in human rights violations. So a recent case in point, Lockheed Martin's recent appointment of retired Lieutenant General Charles Bouchard to lead Lockheed Martin's offices in Canada. It's another example of a revolving door that exists between defense, government, and the arms industry that should be of concern to Canadians. So that's why we invited William Hartung to Ottawa to speak with you, to speak with decision makers and the public at a forum that we're holding in Ottawa this afternoon. He's an expert on the U.S. defense industry, its interests, its lobbying efforts, and its influence. He is the director of the Arms and Security Project at the Center for International Policy and is the author of this book, Profits of War, Lockheed Martin, and the Making of the Military-Industrial Complex. I'd like to welcome William Hartung to the podium.
Thank you, Steve. I'd like to thank the Rideau Institute for organizing this. So I think I can't really start with saying one word about what's happening in the United States today, which is the government shutdown. It's not business as usual. It's kind of almost a pause or a freeze in the way politics normally work in the United States. And the defense issue is somewhat to the side. It's an argument about President Obama's health care plan, whether it should be implemented. It's an argument about what level the U.S. deficit should be at. And it's really a political slugfest between the two parties. And I expect that to go on for some weeks at a minimum. But there will come a point in the foreseeable future when the defense lobby will have its usual place in the budget mix. And I wanted to talk more about that today. The automatic budget cuts that are being implemented as a result of a deal made some time back between the Congress and the President have started to hit. The Pentagon in the current year was called upon to make $52 billion in cuts, which is about 10% of their budget. Now, the Aerospace Industries Association, Lockheed Martin, the entire military-industrial complex in the United States was screaming that these kinds of cuts would undermine our defenses, would devastate our economy, would basically be the worst possible policy decision that could be made at this particular time in the history of the United States. And they did an extensive campaign to that effect with advertising, sending elected representatives around the country, to make their case, commissioning studies, making exaggerated claims about the jobs impacts of Pentagon spending. But all this, for the moment, has come to naught, at least on the notion of the top line of the Pentagon budget, because it's been folded into this larger battle over health care, over deficits, essentially between the Tea Party, the moderate Republican leadership, and President Obama. But nonetheless, we're feeling the effects of the lobby in a number of respects, one of which is in battles over particular systems. So, for example, the F-35 combat aircraft, which Lockheed Martin is trying to sell to Canada, is the largest aircraft program in the history of the United States. The United States' current plans are to buy about 2,400 of these planes to be used not just by the Air Force, but by the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Marines. Now, the program has rife with problems in terms of cost, in terms of performance, in terms of the question of whether it's needed in the new era of warfare as part of a kind of smart strategy for the future. On the performance front, there's very basic problems. Things like there's a helmet which is used for situational awareness for the pilot to let him know what's happening all around him. That is not working. It's got very complicated software, only 20% of which has been completed. It's a stealth plane, and yet the stealth skin of the plane has been peeling due to the heat generated by the engines. And there's many more examples of this. It's having difficulty landing on aircraft carriers. There's been great problems getting it to do a vertical takeoff and landing, which is what it's going to do ideally in the Marine version. All these things have led over the years to a suspension of the Marine project by the Pentagon because of poor performance. There's been reductions in the numbers of planes purchased. But Lockheed Martin and its allies are trying to make sure that this program goes more or less full speed ahead, even though problems are mounting, even if one wanted to build such a system, it would be wise to go more slowly, make sure that the problems are worked out before building planes, many of which have already had to be retrofitted for problems that are occurring. So I think the problem with a big military-industrial complex of the kind we have in the United States is exemplified by the F-35 program in the sense that we're being pushed to buy a plane that's not needed, that doesn't really fit the needs of the new era. The United States is not going to be fighting major boots-on-the-ground wars like Iraq and Afghanistan that call for major air power support. Most of the fighting has been in the nature of using drones, using surveillance, using special forces, all of which raise their own issues about whether and when to use them, but certainly have nothing to do with buying thousands of fighter planes. So there's a distortion that occurs when you have a large defense lobby, both in your defense policy and in how your democratic policy plays out. So, for example, the U.S. defense lobby has 1,000 lobbyists, almost 2 for every member of Congress. 2/3 of those have come from government. They've gone through the revolving door from influential positions in the Pentagon and the Congress. They're now lobbying their former colleagues on behalf of Lockheed Martin and other contractors. So that's just a small kind of bit of what I think one would have in store if Canada were to decide to build its own defense industry. It would create great political issues about how defense policy is shaped. I would, as President Eisenhower warned, I would be very wary of the dangers of having a military-industrial complex which can wield unwarranted influence over government policy. Now, there's 2 other points that I would make quickly. One is the jobs issue. It ends up that the jobs figures promulgated by the arms industry are vastly overstated. More conventional means of estimating would indicate that about 1/3 as many jobs are tied to defense spending in the United States as the industry claims. And spending on anything else, literally, on infrastructure, on clean energy, on education, even a tax cut, would create 25% to up to twice as many jobs as spending on the Pentagon. So in an environment like currently exists in the United States, if you're going to cut domestic programs to leave room to spent on the Pentagon, there's going to be a net loss of jobs. And so this is never pointed out, of course, in the industry's arguments, because they want you to think that if the money's not spent on weapons, it's somehow going to disappear. And that's not the case. It'll be spent elsewhere. It'll be used in the private economy. And there will be perhaps a transition for certain areas, but ultimately the economy could come out of it stronger than it is now. Now, as part of the issue of dealing with potential reductions in Pentagon procurement, U.S. firms have pushed heavily for weapons exports. The U.S. now dominates the trade with about 80% of global sales, an unprecedented margin for any country to have in terms of domination of the arms trade. A lot of it is built on sales to the Middle East, a $60 billion deal with Saudi Arabia that sold them fighter planes, attack helicopters, tanks, small arms, ammunition, almost anything but combat ships. And now there's a deal in the works to sell combat ships in a separate arrangement. So for the United States, this has been a successful short-term strategy in terms of pumping up the profits of the companies. But in the long term, I think it's a fool's errand. Saudi Arabia has its own issues. It's been suppressing democracy movement in Bahrain in connection with the government there. It's an undemocratic regime in its own right. It's been fighting on its borders with Yemen, a conflict for some time. And there's going to come a point where they're going to have to focus on their own internal problems. And ultimately, the day will come when this regime is no longer legitimate. It may not even survive. So the idea of using that as the pillar of your export strategy really makes no sense for the long term. Now, there is good news in the United States and around the world, in that this year, for the first time ever, the United States has, the United Nations rather, has crafted a treaty, the Arms Trade Treaty, which will set international norms so that weapons should not be sold to countries involved in mass atrocities, systematic human rights abuses, major escalations of regional conflicts. And there has never been such a treaty before. There's a treaty about nuclear weapons. There's one about chemical and biological weapons. But arms trade had been sort of the orphan of arms control until now. And 100 countries have signed this, including the United States, most of the European NATO countries, pivotal countries like Mexico, which has felt the impacts of imported arms and violence in their own country. And I think, as one focus, I think Canada would want to join the world community in this new step forward on the arms issue. It's going to take hard work to get countries to ratify it, to have it implemented faithfully. But I think, in the history of the weapons trade, it's a benchmark, a landmark development. And I would think it would be a shame for any country to not be involved in that historic effort in any way, to drag their heels or not join the majority of the world's countries that have already endorsed that effort. So I think those are the main points that I wanted to make, and I thank you all for being here. That's it for now. Thank you.
Any questions?
Strengths of the lobbyists that's maintaining this. I mean, you think of BlackBerry, that's doesn't have a suitable product for the market, and they are allowed to fail. And you're saying F-35 is not suitable, but we continue to pour money into trying to make it suitable. Is it just the tradition of the lobbying that's maintaining that? Or?
Well, I think a product like the F-35, which in my view is not an appropriate aircraft for the kind of problems the United States faces, and has all the problems that I mentioned. I think the arms lobby is a huge part of keeping that afloat. They give contributions to key members of Congress, including, for example, Buck McKeon, who's the head of the House Armed Services Committee. His biggest donors are Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Boeing, the biggest defense contractors in the United States. He has part of the F-35 being built in his district. His district also builds unmanned aerial vehicles. He's head of a caucus to promote spending on UAVs. And even they've gone so far as to, McKeon's wife is running for the state legislature in California. And U.S. defense contractors are also funding her campaign as a way to curry favor with Mr. McKeon. So I think that's a very powerful influence, as well as hiring former members of Congress and the government, to lobby on their behalf, as well as insinuating themselves into government committees. Many of the committees in the government, the Defense Policy Board, the Defense Trade Advisory Group, which deals with arms exports, are populated with representatives of arms companies. So they actually help craft the government policies then they are supposed to abide by. So I think that's a big part of it. Also, you have to look at the Air Force, which I think is very much in the tradition of promoting the fighter pilot as kind of the ultimate, Air Force personnel. And so I think all those things together.
Are you aware of any similar lobbying in Canada, or not on that scale, I guess?
Well, I'm not as familiar with the situation in Canada, but I know Lockheed Martin has hired Canadian generals to lobby on their behalf, has done quite a bit of PR on the jobs front, claiming large numbers of jobs for Canada as part of a purchase of the F-35. And the jobs argument in particular, I think, is overdrawn. There's 8 partner nations building the F-35, also countries like Japan and Israel being brought into the mix. And Lockheed Martin is promising jobs to every one of those countries while promising the United States the maximum number of jobs possible building it. So some countries are going to be sold a bill of goods. They're going to say, we're going to, give you billions of dollars of business, thousands or tens of thousands of jobs building this plane. And when push comes to shove, we'll find that they can't keep all their promises. They can't keep the promises to Italy and Turkey and the UK and Norway and Japan and Israel and Canada simultaneously. So in that sense, they're kind of going around sort of making promises that it's almost impossible for them to keep. But I think the jobs argument and the revolving door are probably the most obvious examples of lobbying in Canada that mirrors things that Lockheed Martin has done in the United States.
Any examples of countries that are able to maintain defense without this kind of expenditure?
Well, the United States spends, until the last few years, had been spending the highest level it had spent since World War II. So higher than Korea, higher than Vietnam, higher than the height of the Reagan buildup, which is why this course correction of 10% still leaves them at quite historically high levels. And there's really no other country that's close to that in terms of spending. The United States spends about 42% of global military spending. So I would think even any NATO member spends considerably less, even though they have their own arms lobbies. They might spend 1% or 2% of their GDP, where the United States is at 4% and rising. But I would say the Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands, Germany to a lesser extent, Japan, have all found a way to supply their defense forces without having as large a military-industrial complex as exists in the United States, although there are the seeds of that in many of the NATO countries.
Very good. Thank you. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.